Alright, let me go to my full presentation view for now. Here's a little disheveled. I just got off the floor. Welcome as always. Happy Thursday. I apologize for last week for taking a break. Unfortunately, I don't have too many other people in my department who feel confident enough to teach the class. So we took 1 week off, but we're here. Intermediate classes today. Let me take these guys off so you don't get that nasty reflection. But yeah, as always, my name is Saxon. I am the camera guy here at the store. I teach all sorts of different classes from beginners, today is intermediate, and then unfortunately, because we've got this holiday next week called Thanksgiving, I won't be teaching any classes. So next Thursday we will be off. We'll kick it back up with the basic camera class at the beginning of December. So yeah, excited for that. So we've got a few viewers right now. I see 6. I might actually have to put my glasses back on. I realized I'm blind as a bat. So we'll give it a couple more minutes. But yeah, today's class is going to be, drum roll please, intermediate. So from intermediate, we're going to talk about a host of different things. But the thing you probably should be the most focused on is that we're going to learn how to break away from automatic and those settings and how to get into more advanced settings with the cameras. Things like ISO, f-stop, aperture, or aperture and f-stop are the same thing. ISO, f-stop and aperture, and shutter speed are going to be the 3 main things that we're covering. We'll talk a little bit about the lenses and things that you should be looking at. Plus I'll bring in what we talked about last week, so framing in some images, what's important to remember that when you're shooting. Talk a little bit more about the dial control because now you'll be breaking away from auto. And as always, guys, I don't have anybody in class with me today, but as it's changed, who knows who else is going to walk in by the time we really get this thing going. But as always, you've got the chat feature. Say hello. I'll give you a shout out if you do, as long as it's appropriate. And yeah, any other questions that you may or may not have on the cameras, please answer and or ask, and I will answer. So I see about a few viewers now, so let's just give it a couple more minutes. I'm going to have a sip of my water, and then we're going to jump into it. I will put my obnoxious glasses back on because I'm blind. I hope everybody's got some fun, exciting Thanksgiving plans set up for the week. I know my family will be in, and we'll be enjoying some turkey and some other stuff. Just got a new stove and a fridge from the store actually not long ago, so I know my grandmother's all excited to test those out for some cookies, and I cannot wait for those cookies. Oh, I'm so excited. I think in the next couple weeks I'm going to work on some jokes, and I'm thinking maybe I'll tell a few jokes before we get this thing going. Nobody ever answers really with them, but you know, I'll say them. Maybe you'll get a chuckle out of it if you're watching at home. Alright, a few more people just logged on there I'm seeing, so let's just jump right into it. People will join as they want. So intermediate camera knowledge. Let's see what that means. So why would you go advanced point and shoot or DSLR or mirrorless? You know, nowadays, 21st century, 2022, I had to think of the date, almost 2023, we all have cell phones. iPhone has a 48 megapixel camera. Google Pixel has a 51 megapixel camera. Samsung has a 105 megapixel camera. You've got powerful phone cameras nowadays, and on top of that too, you're carrying around a cell phone with you. So like, why would you want to get another camera? Why would you want to invest in it? And the answer is pretty simple. Your phone can only do so much. It's not a dedicated camera. It's meant to take snapshots or snippets of stuff versus professional grade photography. There's a reason why when you're getting a Christmas card together, or you have a vacation coming up, or you have some sort of formal event that you're going to, there are professional photographers walking around and not people with their cell phone. At the end of the day, a camera is going to take a much better picture. It's going to have better quality, better lighting. It's also going to be better for blowing it up and making it bigger. So let's say you want to print out a nice big print for the house. You want a beautiful 18 by 24 inch picture for your wall. You're really not going to get that off of your cell phone. Between the cell phone having aspect ratios that are fit for the phone, I like to always say a cell phone is a great thing to have when you're posting on social media, when you're sharing with friends, but Is it going to be comparable to an advanced point and shoot DSLR or mirrorless? Absolutely not. Short answer for that one. So when I talked earlier, I said snippets and snapshots. Here's my difference that I like to show. These are pictures that were taken by one of my colleagues that I love showing. This is an example of a snapshot. And then this is the example of an actual photograph. Looking back at the snapshot, let's talk about it. We see that there's not a lot of thought. You know, if we look at where the escalators are meeting, there's a word I like using in my last class called the horizon line. We consider that the top of the escalators are horizon line. The line where basically our foreground and our background slash like the upper half meet. It's the horizon line. And the idea behind that is if you're looking at a beautiful sunset and you're looking on the ocean, you're going to see a gorgeous line cut across from where the water meets the sky, and you'll see the sun and you'll see the water kind of going in front of it. That's the horizon line with the background and the foreground. So when we look at the escalator, we can see that the escalator is uneven. Lighting doesn't look correct on that. Both of our walls are mismatched. It's not a centered photograph. You have a beautiful ceiling display that we have on one of our escalators where you see all these gorgeous buildings in Chicago, and you can't even see that or the color. It all looks washed out. When we look over here, we can see the advancedness of this photo. You know, we have dramatic lighting coming in from all the sides. This definitely wasn't edited into Photoshop either, which I like to tell customers all the time, which some people believe me, some people don't. I won't argue with you. But this was not edited by a Photoshop. So the color is naturally coming from the camera. Whether now the camera had some, tuning as far as contrast and saturation, hue, that sort of stuff, that's all up to the photographer, all up to the person taking the photo. But the simple things are there. Our horizon line is completely steady and flat. We can see where the escalators are. We can see the glass kind of reflecting from there. We're not seeing a curved image. Our walls are even on both sides. The lighting that's coming from around it is giving this really nice hue, darkens all the corners up and lightens everything as we get to the center. And then you have the beautiful blue color of the sky popping. You don't have a lot of light washing things out. It's just a better photo. It's a photo versus snapshot. So again, here's our snapshot, there's our photo. When you're taking a photo, you're putting more thought into it, and that's something that we talk about in the intro class, where you can shoot on automatic the entire time with your camera. You're going to still get a better photo than your camera or than your phone. The whole question is how are you framing that photo when you're taking it to make it look the best possible? And that's where intro comes in. Now the more advanced, the intermediate, is where we really talk about it. So getting first into it, the first step, as always, learn your camera. I can't stress this enough. If you are confused with what a button means, even if you don't know fully how to use the camera, you should have a basic understanding of what all the knobs, the features, stuff is. You should know the terminology of it. And whether that is watching a million YouTube videos, whether that's reading your handbook 1,000 times, or whether that's just fiddling with it until you figure it out. It's important to know that, because I can tell you all the stuff here, I can give you all the information I have, but at the end of the day, you're the one who has to go out and actually try to use all this stuff and take photos. So it's important, the first things first, always learn your camera. Once we've got there, one thing we didn't talk about the last class, but I like to talk about with this one, is the difference between a JPEG and a RAW. Now, someone actually asked me today what RAW stands for. I have not gotten to the bottom of that, and I will for the next class, because I'm actually curious on what the full definition or term of RAW means. I know it's an acronym. But the best way to understand this is that a typical photo that you're taking on your camera, unless chosen otherwise, will come out as a JPEG. And if we look at the center image, that is a JPEG. Color looks okay, everything is saturated, we have kind of not too dynamic of a photo, but the photo looks clean and processed. When we look at the RAW, to the my left, possibly your right, depending on the viewer's sake, I think it's on all of our lefts if you're looking at my screen. On the left side, if we look at the RAW photo, we're seeing a photo that does not have a lot of saturation. We don't have a lot of darks and lights mixing between them. We have some more muted colors going. Things feel like they're falling in the background because the background is very white. And we can see the difference right off the bat. Now it's important to remember that a JPEG and a RAW have two different file sizes. RAW is going to take up more space and JPEG is going to take up less space. Reasoning behind that is the detail that goes into it. Now you might be saying, I'm looking at the RAW right now, there's no detail in it. Well, the whole point of the RAW is that it can become processed, and what you can do as an artist is really go through and dictate hue, coloration, saturation, exposure, everything, but you have more advanced tools at your disposal. So if you're someone who's interested in using Photoshop, InDesign, any of the Adobe suites, the RAW might be the best way for you to go, because then it allows you to process that RAW and bring out the colors that you want to come out. Maybe you're more concerned about his t-shirt, not necessarily the instrument. You can bring that color and that saturation out in the RAW by processing it, by going through the steps on either Photoshop or any of the other apps. But if you're someone who's taken holiday photos and you just want to send these out when everything is said and done, you probably want to do the JPEG. JPEG is definitely one of the best ways to go. It's one of the ones I use. I personally don't like to fiddle with all my photos, but if you're a professional photographer, you might want to fiddle. Editing software. So one thing I talked about was Photoshop. There is going to be DaVinci on the right side. It's a movie editor primarily, I've seen, but there are really nice features that I have witnessed other people use that can help you edit photos. So if you're someone who is dabbling in between cinematography and photo, and you don't want to be paying for multiple suites, one of the things you can do is look at Adobe Creative Cloud, which I talk about in the next slide. That gives you access to things like Photoshop, InDesign, and then some of their Premiere Pro, which is their editing software for videos. And then the middle one, I always get confused, but I believe that is going to be, oh man, I forgot the name of that one. The middle one, I believe, is a Microsoft program that allows you to do the same thing, where now you're able to edit photos, and it's layers is kind of what the app or what that logo is supposed to look like. Because with layers of an image, you're stacking things on top of each other, so certain marks you make on the top layer won't show on the bottom, or vice versa, depending on what layer's on top. That's what you're going to see first, and then everything else. So another version of that program that you can use. But the idea is that if you are someone who is curious about using RAW photos versus JPEG, and you want to process your RAWs to make them look like a processed RAW, these are the types of softwares you're going to have to look into. They all cost different things. Some have monthly subscriptions, some are a flat rate price. Some have really amazing cloud computing on there like Adobe does, and some also have really great sharing methods too, where other artists can see what you're working on and doing. They can comment, maybe offer advice. You can ask questions on those things, all that sort of stuff. Now, getting past all that stuff, I kind of like to make the intro about, just new things that you might not know about with your camera, especially if you're coming from my intro. Now I like to kind of tone it back down into stuff that we've already talked about. So here we have our mode dial. Mode dial is going to be on the top of the camera. It's going to be a little knob that has all these different symbols, letters, and shapes. To give a nice breakdown of it, we have automatic, we have a program auto, we have aperture priority, shutter priority, and full manual. I think on the next slide, I really break, no, I do not, oh, getting ahead of myself. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about that. You can see all the different buttons on the lens, on the dial here, and all those things mean the same thing. When we look at M, M stands for manual. Manual gives us full control. Let me go back to the other slide, it'll be a little easier to do this. So full manual on the bottom there gives us full control of the whole camera. If you want to be controlling your ISO, your shutter, your f-stop, if you want to set how your focusing is going to be, your exposure compensation, metering, all of that stuff gets controlled under full manual. Can you control it under other things? Yes, but full manual is exactly what it stands for. You have full control over all the settings of your camera as you're shooting. So the goal for most photographers, and I would say a lot of photographers, is to get to that full manual state. Or they want to be in the shutter priority or aperture priority, depending on what they want are shooting. And we'll talk again more about that. I'm going to go back up to auto first though. Auto, plain and simple. And I'm sorry if I keep touching my nose. We are in the fall now, or winter now here, guys, so my allergies are kicking butt. So sorry about that. But automatic is going to allow for the camera to do everything for us. We basically point and shoot the camera, frame things up on the LCD screen or viewfinder the way that we want them, and then from there pull the trigger, shoot, and get a clean photo. Program auto Still going to do things on automatic, but now you have a little more control over what you're setting. So you can go physically into the settings, set everything to be where you want it to be. Every time you go back to program, it's going to go automatically back to the settings that you were using. When you switch between manual, shutter, and aperture, it's going to switch the numbers up a little bit based on what the last part of the camera was. They do that to keep consistency for when you're shooting. If you, let's say you're going from one setting to the other. If when you were shooting in manual, you had the proper settings, but now you're like, oh, let me switch to shutter because all I want to do is control the shutter. It basically takes what was there, moves it over, and then now you just have full control over the shutter. So if you were on an f-stop of 2, your ISO was 800, and now you're just switching from manual to shutter. Now the thing you'll have control over is the shutter. The camera will stay at those numbers, but then because they're going to be automatic, they will just continue to fluctuate and adjust based on what you're taking photos of. You have full control over the shutter speed though. Aperture, same idea. You bump to aperture now. Shutter is going to be controlled by the camera. It'll open and close based on the lighting situation that it sees fit. Now, with that being said, let's see, Google has say R. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know what that meant. I'm going to ignore that chat. My apologies. Wish I knew what you were saying. Now, automatic, just said, program auto said aperture and shutter priority. So aperture and shutter priority are the two. A lot of people love to use them, especially if you don't want to do the full manual. They're nice because you can just focus on one of the things that you're changing constantly. The camera can do all the work for you, but you're controlling either the speed at which the shutter is shutting and closing, or you're controlling the iris of the aperture. And I'll get into what that means, but basically it's the little hole that gets bigger or smaller depending on what number that you set it to. As funny as that might sound. So we'll jump to the next slide here. So with all that being said, oh, Google has says hi. Hi there, Google has. Alright, let's talk more about the exposure triangle. So this is my favorite thing to talk about. I think this should be in every artist's toolbox, but this is the meat and potatoes of what we're talking about today. Aperture, shutter, and ISO. This is the hamburger photo stops cheat card. This is one of my personal favorites. I've seen this in college. I have seen this in high school classes. I've even seen kids have this randomly on some books. Like, this is the #1 thing. A lot of people will show this as a triangle, but I like to think, because the idea behind the triangle is that all three are kind of coexisting together in order to make the perfect photo. Perfect photo is then through the middle of the triangle. But I like to put them on a line because, again, if you're someone who's shooting on just aperture priority or shutter priority, you don't necessarily need to worry about all three in conjunction. But you need to understand what does each of these three things mean as a photographer. That's where the intermediate or the advanced comes in. So start off with aperture. Aperture is a funny thing because the higher the number, the more we're going to see, and the lower the number, the less we're going to see. Now, aperture is the small hole or the iris on the lens. Now, if I pull out a lens right now, or you have a lens at home and you pull that thing out, look at this. It's going to be an example of all these middle rings that come around, and they basically form a circle in the center. Now, the idea is much similar to our eye. If anything, actually, it's the same idea. When we are outside and we're looking at something, our iris, so the small black part of our eye, is going to get real tiny. You are a parent who is getting ready to do some scouting videos for your kids. They're in high school, they're ready for college. This is the story I always get. They want a camera that captures a fast-paced picture and can get good clarity with it. They've got a track runner or a lacrosse player, a soccer player, a football player. They're in the stands, they want to get a good picture. What do? I tell them to switch to shutter priority and learn how to use this. The slower that you go with a picture for shutter priority, the more light and the more information you're letting into the camera. The problem with that is that if it's a moving image, you have a lot more room for error as far as motion and stability goes. If you're using a half a second, so that's what that 1/2 stands for at the bottom right corner, you are going to get a lot of motion unless you're using a tripod, and if you don't have anything that's moving. And I have some examples that show long exposure photos that look awesome. 1/4, 1/8, same idea. More motion, slower reaction time. 1/500, 1 in 20, 250. I hate fractions. I just want everyone to know that. The shutter always goes by fractions. Drives me nuts. But you guys can read the numbers and get it. The faster this person is moving, the faster we want the shutter speed to go. And I've got a rule of thumb to put on the next one, but the faster the object of what we're taking a photo is in motion, the faster the motion they have, the faster we want our shutters to close. If we let them stay open too long, we're allowing too much to happen, and there's more margin or room for error as things can become blurry and as things are moving. So we want to make sure that we are using our shutter speed appropriately, and I have some examples. There we go. So, for example, if we are an action photographer, the sports scenario that I mentioned earlier, we want to use a freezing action or faster. And a freezing action in the camera world is going to be 1 in 1,000ths, or 1 in 1,000th of speed. So it is closing at a thousandth of a second. Thousandths of a second. I don't even know, but you get my picture. It is going that fast. So, I don't even think I could, something around those nature. That's too slow. But it is closing very fast. What is that doing for us? It is freezing the motion. It is capturing the image at its best. The water has a lot of motion going. The water is a violent surface, and it's a really hard thing to photograph for most beginners. And I say that because the movement of the water is so sporadic and so uncontrolled that unless you have a way of controlling the environment which you're in, maybe via a set or via a room that you're in that doesn't have wind or motion, you're able to do a lot more. But in this case, we have to be able to get the person still. So we have to sacrifice something. We can see the blurriness of the water, and we can see the movement of the water is still there. But when we look at our surfer, he is almost in perfect clarity and in condition because we were able to take a picture in 1/1000th of a second or faster. So we were able to capture the main subject matter. So this is probably using an autofocus that's more lined in. I would say it's a tighter continuous autofocus that's on the subject. On top of that too, we have a little bit of separation going between the background and the foreground, so we're allowing a good amount of light in. It's not necessarily a 1.8 or a 1.4, but it probably is like a 2 or a 2.8. And then we also have the 1 in 1,000ths of a speed going. So we have fast camera with a decent f-stop. So if we were controlling this in full manual, we might also then set the ISO to 150. And we'll talk about ISO. I don't want to confuse anybody with that. Right now we're just talking about controlling the shutter. So 1 in 1,000ths to get a fast action for the camera. Giving a sense of motion. We like motion with these because motion shows that this object is not still. It is not stationary. It is moving. And for that, there's a little bit more kudos that goes to the photographer because, wow, how are you able to get a hummingbird who moves its wings faster than any other bird alive in that clarity? Shutter speed. This is definitely using 1 in 1600ths of a second. I've seen it done before with for photographers. 1 in 1,000ths will not cut it. You need to jack it up a little bit higher. Hummingbirds are moving in such detail and clarity. Now, the other thing to keep in mind too, if we're looking at this photo, look at the background. Can you read that background? No. You have absolutely no idea what the background is. Could be a tree. Could be a cage of some sort. This could be a set that was built by somebody, and they're allowing the bird to come in to maybe like a honey cove to get a taste so they could get a clean shot. I know Nat Geo does this all the time. But what we're seeing in this is a perfect clarity on the bird's body. But where's our motion? That motion is in the wings. No matter how fast we get this, we can still see the wings are shutting in and out. So we can still see the motion of the bird as it's going. And that's important because we're giving a sense of motion while capturing the clarity and the beauty of the bird. It's not an easy task to do. It takes a lot of practice with the shutter speed. But once you get it, these are some of the results that you can get. I would say that this lens definitely was a nicer lens, like a 1.4 or 1.8. But you don't have to worry about shutter speed as the lens are concerned. The number on the lens for f-stop is really about that background to foreground separation and the amount of light let in to the camera via the iris or the f-stop of the aperture. Now, creating mood with long exposure. So I mentioned earlier that for some people, they might want to use long exposure to get more detail and saturation out of their items. When we look at this beautiful waterfall, we can see the motion is all in the water. We see the movement. We see the clarity of the water because of the long exposure. But we see the movement of the water. Now, what do I mean by long exposure? Earlier, we talked about a half a second there, right? Half a second would be considered a long exposure, and you can go even longer than that. There's a setting on your camera that changes from model to model. I learned it as B for bulb. And B for bulb stands for that you are allowing the camera's shutters to open, and they either only close after you release the button or close when you shut the button again. And what that did was created a long exposure that oversaturates images and creates a beautiful sense of motion. Now, to explain how this photo would have been taken, we have a camera set up on a tripod. There has to be a tripod for this or some sort of stand. If there's even a little motion in the body at all, the green, the mountains, the lushness, the color, all of that would be blurred and skewed, and there's no way of fixing that without redoing the whole photo. But that beautiful color that we have from the water and the clarity that we have mixed with the movement, that's all coming from the long exposure. So in reality, this photo could have been exposed for maybe 10 seconds, 15 seconds, possibly 20. It definitely would have been longer than 1 500ths. It definitely would have been longer than 1.5. This easily could have been a 5-second photo too at the shortest. But the idea behind doing this is the sense of motion that you're creating, the color that you're getting out of this, the detail in the photos. You wouldn't be able to get this in any other settings. Maybe if you played with the exposure compensation and did that stuff. But this is an example of now, instead of going fast with your shutter priority, you are going slow with your shutter priority. It's a little difference. Another example I have of this is the train. Now, our gentleman here, or the person behind him taking the photo, obviously either has this on a tripod or is holding this on their lap or on a bench. I imagine it's a bench just because of the level. We have the bike in the foreground. That bike is not moving. It is stationary. It's in perfect detail because as this photo was going, it was not moving. The person, also not moving in the background. Perfect detail. We can see the folds, the reds in the shirt, all the hues and saturation. We can see his pants have the same wrinkles, shoes, etc. Braking has good color. The up of the building, if we look at the top of the train area, we can see all of that information is really clear and detailed. But now as we look through the train, it almost looks like a blur of light. And that's because as the train is going at such a high rate, we're only catching the light. The camera's always attracted to light. So that's the first thing that it absorbs is the light in the area. In this case, it's got the top of the train lights, the side lights, you can see some of the window areas. But if we look through the train and we look at the background of the wall, we can see that we can read the physical name of one of the buildings. And that's because this train is going so quickly that those in-between areas of the train are able to pick up from the camera what that is. And so because that sign isn't moving, it's still stationary. We can still see it. So it's important to remember that for a lot of these long exposures, as long as you have your camera stationary and it is on a flat surface not moving, and the subject matter of which you're trying to get is moving at a cool rate or a fun rate, you can get something like this where, again, motion is all in the train. That is the thing that's moving, and our person and our bike are very stationary and left clear. Why use shutter priority? I like to show this photo. I think this is the best example of it. You would use shutter priority for motion, for sports, for anything where you don't care necessarily to control ISO, aperture. You want to just control how fast is this thing going. This is a great example of a photo that I see all the time. Customers come in, they're like, my camera doesn't work. And I'm like, oh, what's going on? Let me take a look. And I'll look at it and I'll see these and I go, well, how were you taking this photo? And they're like, well, I put it on full auto or I did manual and I did everything that I've learned. And I'm like, okay, well, if you're doing full manual, what's your shutter speed? And I can actually, if you're brand new to this, go onto your camera, hit the playback button, look at all the pictures that you've taken, click the info button after that. If you're someone who's shooting on full auto, you're actually able to do a really cool thing where you can open up the actual settings of the camera and see, or you can open up the photos that are on the camera and see exactly what speed, what aperture, what f-stop they're being taken at, and how the camera is adjusting for that. And I use that as a training tool because I think that overall, if you're brand new to this and you don't have the keen eye to identify light, spatial recognition, or the speed of an object that a camera can then capture, using auto Hitting the playback and looking at how the camera was able to do that will inform your decisions for the future and help make it a little bit easier when you're trying to get into taking photos and dig a little deeper. So why use shutter priority? It's important because if you're trying to capture motion, speed, or anything that involves movement, you want to use it so that way you get the best, most clear photo possible. Another example of something that's probably shot at least a 1,000th or higher of a second. When we look at this photo, we can see the detail and the clarity in the biker. We see the background is separated just a little bit, but the background's not much. This is in some sort of either stadium or outdoor arena, so we can see that those are overhead beaming lights that are shining down to illuminate on whatever event it is. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's a bokeh effect, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it has a lens with a very low f-stop. I can't really determine the f-stop personally on this one. I would probably say it's a 4, maybe a 5. But the main thing we're looking at is shutter speed, and if we look at the shutter on this one, we can see the motorcycle clear, the person's clear, maybe a little bit of movement on the little arm that's latching onto the physical bike. I see a little bit of blurriness by the bicep there. It's a possibility. Looking at ISO. So same shutter speed and aperture, but a different ISO for all 4 of the photos. Now, why does ISO matter? ISO, I don't actually know what ISO stands for. I'm terrible, I know. But ISO, when I learned it and how I teach, is it's the amount of light that the camera lets in and the amount of information the camera can then read from there. When we look at a thing of ISO 100, when we look at the top left image, everything feels dark and moody. The pier itself is dark, the water underneath the pier is almost black, the sand is black, maybe you don't even know that's sand, that could be concrete for all you know, and the skyline too has this beautiful color and saturation, but it gets this dark hue that folds around it. When we look at the right side at 200, now our background is a little lighter. It's not as dark, and now we have a little less intense shadow on the beach, and we have a little less intense shadow behind the pier. Keep going down from there. 400, we got more background. We got more water in the foreground there in the front. We can make out the color of the sand a little bit better. If I had to make a pick on these 4 photos, 400 feels the best to me. And then we move to 800. Now we've got a much more washed out background. Things are brighter. The pond in the front, or the ocean water that's in the foreground, is brighter. The sand has more saturation. You can actually see the sand bank a little bit better. And then the pier obviously looks really good, or the dock looks great too. So when I'm looking at these, I'm really looking at, what is it that ISO is doing for me? It allows for light to come into the camera. It allows for things to be brighter on the page. But there's also some disadvantages to using ISO that you need to be aware of. Noise. ISO and noise go hand in hand. As we jack up that ISO and turn that number up, we are also basically overdoing the camera. We're overpowering the saturation and the color. We want to be sparse with ISO. I personally shoot with an 800 ISO at all times. People think I'm crazy about it. They say my photos look grainy, but I look for that because when I'm shooting, I want to get the closest to a film quality photo as possible. When I first learned how to shoot on an SLR years and years ago, one of the things that I learned with doing it was that the film that you're buying has a number on there. 800, 400, 100, 100 being some of the most sensitive to light. That's referring to the ISO. Back in the SLR days, you didn't get to control your ISO. What your film said that number was what your film said that number was, and then you controlled the aperture and the f-stop exclusively. And it made shooting a little bit easier. It also made it more complicated in the sense that you either had to develop your own film or you had to take it to somebody to develop it and pay all this money. I actually just did all that. I shoot film on vacations because I think it's a lot of fun and I like to not know what I'm taking photos of. And when I, send it all back in, I get surprised with all these beautiful images, and then the people that I'm taking photos with, they get a kick out of it too. But that's a different story. When you're using this, 100 ISO is a great way to get started. 100 to 150 are the 2 ISO numbers that a lot of people start in. It gives the least amount of grain and the least amount of noise, and you get a clean image. Now, depending on your lighting situation, that's where it might flux. The cool thing is that most cameras nowadays have what's called exposure compensation. When you look through the view glass or through the viewfinder viewfinder at the LCD screen, you'll see a little metering piece on the bottom, and I think I talk about this on a later slide, so we'll get to that in a second. But some cameras allow you to even control manually your exposure compensation, so you can actually adjust that, and that's a good way of getting around the graininess of the photo, depending on if you're using auto ISO or if you have it set to a number that you like. ISO will help you get more light and more information from it, but it'll also make the photos grainier. So it's important to play with your ISO and figure out when and when you don't need it. Auto ISO and when to use it. My best example are the parents that I get who are ready for prom or for homecoming. They're going to be doing photos at 4 different places. They've got a beautiful photo here at Apt Electronics in front of our fountain. They're going to then take a picture at Sarah's house, and then John's backyard is gorgeous, has a lake behind it, so they want to take photos there. How do you go about switching your ISO between those things? Well, you don't. You use on auto ISO, or you should use auto ISO in those situations, because to sit there and to play with and fiddle with the ISO every time you go, you could be missing moments. You could be taking less photos because of that, or you could take a bunch of photos and then find out they all look terrible at the end because it was too grainy or too dark. Auto ISO takes care of all of that stuff, and you should be able to set that on the camera whether or not you're using full manual, aperture priority, shutter priority, or auto in general. It's a great tool to use, and I always recommend using auto ISO when you're shooting in between different locations. If you're in the same location and you're in the same shooting environment, let's say you're outdoors and it's a perfectly sunny day, you're not going to be switching, the sun is out constantly. 150 ISO, 100 ISO, perfect. You're indoors, it's a dark, maybe it's a haunted house, and it's going to stay this darkness kind of the whole way through. Turn that ISO up a little bit. Maybe open that f-stop up a little bit more too, so that way it's nice and wide, so you get everything in the all the information that you need. And then maybe have a maybe just do auto. Yeah, I would say keep. Now that I'm thinking about that, oh man, I hate having to think. Let me make sure I'm getting the right. If you're in a haunted house, I've actually never presented myself with this situation. If you're in a haunted house, you're taking photos, I would probably set the ISO to a 12 or 1600, depending on the darkness, maybe a little higher, 3200 at the most. I would probably then go to a shutter priority, because I want to control the variability of the shutter. My aperture will open and close based on the light that's around it, and I'm not necessarily concerned. A little bit of beard in my mouth. Sorry, guys. I'm not necessarily concerned about my background to foreground separation in this case, unless I am. But a 3200 ISO, 1 in 100ths to 1 in 200ths for my shutter speed, and yeah, I would let aperture just run and be controlled by the camera itself. This is for a haunted house specifically. Don't quote me on that. Try it yourself, so that way you know. I don't like haunted houses, so I can't tell you too much. But again, auto ISO would be a great thing to use when you are in and out of different situations and you don't necessarily want to sit there and fiddle with the ISO number, take a couple test samples, see the graininess. Let the camera do the work. If you're in between places and locations, you focus on the other parts of the camera, which are the shutter speed and the aperture. Those are your two most important. As you get a little more advanced, as you learn about studio lighting and different lighting situations, as you practice, you will see the difference. And again, when all else fails, play with automatic. Take as many photos on auto as you can, hit the playback button, and look at what the camera is dictating for your ISO, your f-stop, and your aperture, and your shutter speed. That is the best way a photographer can learn all those things, but learn what the camera is dictating, and then from yourself determine what you're doing. Now to review everything, let me see if I can move my little square. There, okay, let me see, can I grab? Yeah, there we go, I should be on this side anyway. Alright, when we look at this, what are we looking at? We're seeing our f-stop at the top there. Now, this is a pretty bad photo to use, but I like my piggies, so I'm going to keep it there. You got piggy on f.1.4. You can barely make out the background. If you didn't have the 16 next to it, you probably wouldn't be able to tell that they're taking a picture on a couch and that they're doing this as like a little photo shoot and demonstration. As you keep raising up that f-stop though, the background becomes much more clear and we can see exactly what's going on in that photo a little bit more. We are losing the background to foreground separation as we make our f-stop higher. The lower the f-stop, the wider that iris, and the more information we're able to pick up from the foreground and less of the background. And as we keep moving up, it just becomes more and more about the background and foreground relationship and how much of the background that we can see to what's in our foreground. Going to shutter speed, same idea. I think we flip-flop the numbers though. So rather than it being where the lower the number, the faster it's going, or bigger. The lower the number, the slower it's going, and the faster the number, the more information. So we have a hammer swing. And I think the most important thing to remember with all of these examples, much like my other examples kind of go, is that we can imagine with this that when we're shooting on any of these three settings, ISO is being controlled on one, but everything else is the same. The shutter speed is being controlled on that middle one, but everything else is the same, and the f-stop is being controlled on that, and everything else is the same. It's important to remember all that. Shutter speed, the hammer is coming down, it's a swinging motion, it's fast. Half a second will not get it. You can barely make out what that is, but what's not moving is that piece of wood, and that's why we can see that piece of wood more clearly, with more detail. If we look at it, the wood is a little darker on the photo, we get less of that lightness as we go up. The camera is able to read more information about still in the not moving products or items, and it's able to give you more information on it. As we then keep going and get faster and faster, we're not necessarily losing any detail in the wood because it is just a blank piece of board, but we can see the hammer and the fist are coming down and we can see the detail on those. Plus, the wood as a whole, as we get a little bit faster, gets lighter. Again, that's all based on the fact that when we are trying to capture motion, we can see the motion coming through. We want to get that speed. So for action photography, for freeze frame photography, we want what number? No, none of you guys get it. No, it's fine. I'm kidding. We want 1 in 1,000ths. We want it to be quick. We want the shutters to real fast. If you're doing action photography, like real sports, real fast-paced stuff, I probably would recommend jacking that number up even higher. But again, that's all stuff to play with and to learn as you're taking photos. And the only way to get a better feel for how your camera performs the best for what you're trying to do is to practice. Take these tools out in the field and try. ISO, let's move down. 100 is one of my favorite ISOs to use because you get a pretty true-to-life image, not a lot of grain, but more information the camera is able to pick up, but not a lot of light that it's letting in. The ISO on the bottom there, we can see it at 100, pretty perfect. That's a penny, that's a wooden table. We can make out the background and foreground separation, doesn't matter. They're literally probably less than a millimeter away from each other based on how small a penny is. I actually heard this the other day. A penny technically has 3 sides when you really think about it. I'm just saying. Front side, back side, and then the flat side that goes all the way around. It's got 3 sides. Anyway, ISO 100, got that over there so we can see that the background or the table has good color, the penny has good color, not a lot of graininess. As we keep moving, we see that the penny gets lighter and lighter, less detail there, and the wood behind it starts to lose its darkness. So now we're getting much more grainy, pixelated quality on that image, and it's all because we're taking our ISO and we're turning it up. For something like this, it probably doesn't need a high ISO. ISO 2500 is probably a silly thing to use. But ISO 100, ISO 250, even ISO 400, you get a little bit more background to foreground separation and you can clearly make out the color of the table and the penny. Not saying you couldn't with the ISO 100, but maybe you want it to be a little bit lighter depending on the situation. Again, it sets a little bit more moody with the 100 and it starts to become a little bit more lighter, washed out with the 4. And then by 2500 you can see those specks and the graininess in there. And it doesn't really do anything for the photo, no purpose for that. Now exposure meter, I talked about exposure compensation. Some cameras, most mirrorless cameras that you see will have this new dial that has a +1, -1, +3, -3, +4, -4, and it has a little rotatable dial. Now, exposure compensation is another way we get around ISO. Depending on what we set our ISO to, we can also control exposure compensation. And as we're looking through the LCD viewfinder, as we're looking through the LCD screen or the viewfinder, we can actually turn the dial and it will bring those numbers in flux. Now, if we're shooting on automatic and we're looking through our viewfinder, there is a button on the camera. Usually it is a square box, and it'll have a dash going through it. One side will have a minus sign, and it'll be all white. The other side will have a plus, and it'll be all black. That is our exposure compensation button. If we click that, it should pull the meter up on the bottom of the camera, and we can read it. Now, if we're shooting in full manual and we don't have exposure compensation, we are able to use the meter to determine what settings we need to pull the camera to, whether that is f-stop, whether that's shutter speed, or whether that is a ISO. And from there, we'll watch our exposure meter go one way or the other. If we get it perfectly in the center, it is going to take a clean image with everything on the camera being set to the middle, to being the perfect for that image. A lot of photographers will use this. Now on the flip side, if you go -1, you're going to get a darker image. And you might want that because you might want to set the mood a little bit darker. I took a bunch of cool photos with my friends over the Halloween time. They had beautiful costumes that they put on, and they wanted to just do like a fun photo shoot at a cemetery. And I kid you not, we set ours down to -1 with a higher ISO. The photos came out slightly grainy, but we had these awesome photos with dark vignettes on the sides. Their costumes were gorgeous, but we did that as an artistic choice to make things more gloomy and dark, to set the mood. The holidays are coming up now. We're getting into Christmas, we're getting into Thanksgiving, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, all those good things, right? We might not want to do something dark and gloomy. Nobody wants to see Santa all dark next to their kid. We might want to see it a little lighter, so we might go to the plus side and make it a little bit lighter, and that's where then we'll see some things become washed out. The color starts to get lost, the light starts to take over on the camera. That's where we play with that, but we have the ability to do that when we either have an exposure meter that we can set and we can play with the ISO, the f-stop, and the shutter speed, or we have an exposure meter, which gives us the same thing but more of a handheld switch. So if you're someone who's interested in doing that, when you're buying a camera, you might want to look to say, hey, does this camera have an exposure meter, and does it have exposure compensation where then I can physically manipulate that exposure? All things to be asking when you're looking at your next camera. Now, full manual, just getting back into it, it's control over both the aperture and the shutter speed. Now, for those who don't know, with manual, you can, if you truly want to, set ISO to auto. Every camera might be a little different on the availability of how you do this, but all cameras should allow you to set aperture, or ISO to auto. Having control over both aperture and shutter, I think is a wonderful thing. If you are brand new to photography and you've never done this before, I wish that there was more film classes out there for you. I wish there was more film photography available nowadays, because to truly understand photography, the best way, and why they do it in college and high school, and I'm so glad they still do, is with film. I have so many people that talk about film with me and how they miss it, and so many of my generation, I'm only 26, so many of my people that are in my age group, a little younger, even a little older, up to 30s, they love shooting on film because they get that exact thing that I'm talking about, where you really do have to control your aperture and shutter speed, and not only do you have to control that, you have absolutely no idea what that image is going to look like by the end. Is it more feasible and cheaper to use digital? Absolutely. Hands down, digital is the better way to go. But if you're someone who can learn to use your aperture and your shutter on your actual camera, I would really recommend looking into film. You can bring all your film to Walgreens and have it developed. It's an amazing thing. I just dropped off everything. I think it cost me $40 to develop 2 or 3 rolls. Not the cheapest thing in the world, but at the end of the day, I get all these digital photos that I can do whatever I want with, etc. Not trying to sell you on it, but you get what I'm saying. Full manual is the way that cameras have always been used prior to the digital age. If you can learn how to focus on just your aperture, move to shutter speed, learn how to use that. And once you become comfortable with the two, bring them together. Start playing on full manual. Learn how to do all that stuff, because at the end of the day, it's only going to make your photos better, but it's going to give you, the person who's holding the camera, the most control over this $1,000 investment, this $2,500 investment, or this project that maybe you bought years ago and you've put it in a drawer and you've never touched because of COVID or life. So Take the time, practice, learn how to use it, and you won't be upset. More examples. I show this photo probably every time I teach this class. When we're looking at this photo, let me see, can I get webcam? Okay, there we go. There's like a little weird ring on there. When I look at this photo, I see a lot of great detail, but the thing that I notice the most with this one, so let's start at the very beginning. We have a horizon line in the background. That is going to be nice and flat, so we can see that we're on a very clear level plane. We have good background to foreground separation, but not enough that we really need to care about this one. So the f-stop is probably going to be higher. It's probably going to be a 22 because we're trying to get the whole picture, not just segments. From there, the lighting looks really good. The ISO looks really good. I probably would put this at a 400 to 800 ISO, maybe a 600 to 800 ISO to not be as broad. But there's not a lot of graininess on the photo. As I look, I can see some graininess underneath the pillars. So where those like bridge lines are coming down, where the graffiti is on the one side, I see a little bit of grain and a little bit of texture. The wood, though, looks awesome on the bridge. Full of color, vibrant. So honestly, I probably, and then shutter speed, I probably would put this at a 1 1/100th, 1 200th, because the detail on there, I mean, this could have been done on a tripod, and if it was, they could have done the exposure for even longer, and that could be where we're seeing the nice coloration in the brick building and the backgrounds there, where it's not just all one tan color, we see variation between all the bricks. So my school of thought for this one would be f-stop of 22, would probably be about an ISO of 600 to 800, and then the last thing I would say is that the actual shutter speed is probably going to be a slower number with a tripod. So we're getting a lot of detail, a lot of information, but we don't have a lot of movement, so it doesn't matter. Next one, we're looking at a flower. We're looking at a branch of flowers. Now this one we can get a little bit more tricky with this one. The coloration. So if we look at it, not a lot of doom and gloom, not a lot of moodiness. We have a lot of light, a lot of vividness. So we have what we see there is probably going to be a shorter f-stop, or I mean a shorter shutter speed, I would say. It's probably a quick glance. We don't need a lot of information on this one because there's so much outside light coming in that we can allow for a little bit of shorter period of time. Also, there's not enough detail on the flowers for me to get too into it and say that it was done at a fast shutter speed. So I'd say between 100 and 200ths of a second, maybe 3, 4. But a 100th to 200th seems like a good speed to me. From there, we got a good background to foreground separation. Now, can we detect what that background is? Yes, we can see branches, we can see multiple leaves on there. So we know that this branch that we're taking a picture of, there's more of the same branches behind it. So f-stop, 2.8, maybe a 3.5. Most likely this was done in a kit lens of some sort. Now the thing that gets me with this photo is there's a little bit of graininess in there, and it's kind of hard to detect. But because I shoot with such high grain, I'm used to seeing this, and I'm sorry I keep like looking at the camera because I'm trying to look at the photo deeper. But for this, I would probably say the grain is, you're probably shooting on like a 300 to 400 ISO, maybe a little higher than that. Obviously, the lighter outside it is, and the higher your ISO is, the more grain you will see at a lower number. Versus like, when you're shooting at night and you're shooting with 3200 ISO, and you see all this grain. It's a completely different story. But you can still see grain on a low number if you're not, depending on the setting that you're using. So that could be what we're seeing here. But background to foreground separation looks good. The flowers look really clear. So my thesis on this one is that background to foreground separation is between a 2.8 and a 3.5. The shutter speed on this one is not quick because there's not enough definition in the flowers. We don't see a lot of shadow play. Everything looks very light. So my imagination with that is a quick shutter speed as well there. 100 to 200 in the speed. And then from there too, we're probably looking at something with maybe a 400 ISO, 600 ISO. I probably would say 400. 200 to 400 ISO. It's grainy only because the ISO is a little higher, but not quite grainy enough that an average photographer would notice. My fireman's here. So The firemen, if we look at them, he's in pretty good detail in the foreground there. I don't see any grain on him, so auto ISO could be on this one. Also could be about a 150, 200. It is a little bit darker in the background, so maybe the ISO would be a little bit up from there. But in reality of this, there's a good background to foreground separation going. I would probably put that at a 1.8 to 2.0, maybe 2.8 at the highest, depending on how far away that fireman in the background is. But overall, I'm seeing good clarity, good detail on the face, so we can make him out, but we can't see him perfectly. So you have no idea who that person is, but you can see the shape and the shadow of him. As we look at the guy in the front there, he's in perfect clarity. Focusing is good on him. Shutter speed probably doesn't matter in this much. I mean, this is probably a staged photo. If they did a longer exposure, they probably could get away with it, just to capture the detail, because when you look at like his communicator of some sort, the radio, the walkie-talkie he's got here, if you look at the PTFD on the top there, we look at the helmet, the coloration there, all that looks like it was captured in really nice close-up detail. So my assumption for that one is that the shutter speed on that is going to be a little bit longer if it is in fact a staged photo. If this is on the move, it's probably going to be a little bit faster. My ram's head, I like showing this one. You get a lot of detail with the ram's head there, so for this one I probably would use a shutter priority, because I'd probably want to do some form of a long exposure to get that much detail out of the horns, the fur. That's not a quick image, that's not a snapshot, that's nor is that you taking a quick photo. That is something that has at least a decent amount of exposure, possibly with a tripod, but because animals are sporadic in the movement, you're probably using a monopod of some sort if they're using anything at all. But in general, that definitely wouldn't have a short shutter speed. That would definitely be longer. Not a half a second, but definitely not like 1 1/100th of a second, So, I mean, it could be 1 1/100th of a second. Not like 1 500th of a second, I should say. It's got more clarity than that. So maybe 1 1/100th, or maybe a little bit slower, depending on the situation or the variability of this RAM and how it moves. But good detail there. Now when we look at the ISO on this one, I don't see really any graininess. Given that this guy is so dark, I probably would put this at about 150 to 300 for ISO, just to compensate for all of the darkness in the physical fur of the RAM. Yeah. F-stop would definitely be something that, and then f-stop too. Background to foreground separation, not so much. So maybe an f-stop of 16 or an f-stop of 14, something where you can still see everything clearly in the background, but it's still not in complete focus because our main subject is the RAM. These are my motion pictures. I love these. So these were definitely done in either a shutter priority or in a full manual. We've got the dog on the left who is in motion, catches the frisbee. He's in perfect clarity, or she's in perfect clarity. The grass on the bottom, we can see a little bit of that. So in my opinion, this is probably touched up at the very end to kind of give more definition to that area. I could be wrong, but just seeing the background to foreground separation and how there's that one split of grass, I think that might have been done in post. This might be a raw photo. But regardless, you can't really make out the background. I can see trees, and I imagine those are cars in the background. This is some sort of park that they're playing at. But the dog's in perfect clarity. There's not a lot of grain, if any grain, and we get a really nice background to foreground separation. So ISO's kept super low. Shutter speed is at least 1 1,000th or higher. And then background to foreground separation, we're probably looking at least a 1.4 or 1.8. Moving over to the right photo, dog's in clear motion. It actually hasn't even caught the frisbee this time. Its mouth is open, which is even awesomer. You really get the intensity of the motion. You know this dog's in air, and it's ready to get that thing. So it's probably 1,000ths of a second, if not maybe higher, like 1600ths of a second. Background, you can clearly make it out. It's not necessarily in perfect focus, so I'd probably put that at an f-stop of, let's not say 22, but maybe like a 16 or a 14, something where I can still make it out. And then on top of that too, the background on the bottom there is touched up a little bit by this artist, by Claudio. So, yeah. Another motion, another example though, Got the football player diving into the end zone. He's in great clarity. We see the full detail on him. Now when we're looking at the background, we can see that there is movement in the background still, but we can tell that a couple blockers missed the tackle. So it's probably going to be an f-stop of 16, possibly 22 because of the motion on this one and because of the speed this guy is running at to avoid the tackle. We could be looking at an f-stop of 22. Shutter speed is at least 1,000ths or higher. In this case, I probably would put it at 1600ths of a second, just to be quicker. On top of that, too, we're looking at ISO on this guy. I don't see a lot of graininess in the dark parts of this. I mainly see movement and kind of just excitement there. So ISO is probably 100 to 150. And yeah, I would say that's probably all that we're looking at here. But this is a great photo. One of the things I do talk about in my other class in the beginner's photography is getting on the same level as the subject matter. A photographer at this level would probably be standing up, shooting down, technically, when you think about it, because of wherever the angle is. So for this photographer, they definitely got low. They squatted with the camera. I know a lot of these guys that are shooting pictures on the sidelines of games, a lot of the times are sitting with the tripod between their legs, so they can get these types of shots. There's guys sitting, guys standing when they're playing games like this, basketball too. Sometimes getting on the level of the person that you're taking a photo of becomes more powerful, and in this case, you can really feel this guy jumping into the end zone because we're on the same level as him. Our eyes are attracted to that sort of thing. A bike. Now, for this one, I've been trying to deduce this. I want to say this is a long exposure shot, and the reason I say this is, if I bring the mouse onto the screen here, if we look, it won't let me go lower because I have the page kind of divided. If we look right where the bike is, and now let's look behind the back wheel at what looks like a train docking station, we can see that there are some lines that are moving pretty quickly behind the bike. My assumption is that this is a long exposure photo, and that's also why we have those lights that are all blurred in like that, because what's happening is the camera is able to pick up those lights, and then naturally these things just keep spidering, because as we're doing a long exposure, we're allowing for the light to continuously hit our sensor of the camera, giving more definition. Where is all that light going? They almost look like nativity scene stars or shining bright orbs that you would see in the sky of an alien invasion sort of thing, right? But those are street lights. They've just had such a long time of exposure that they've lent themselves to be as bright as a star. But overall, we have a dark photo. We've got some graininess in the sky if we look a little bit closely. So ISO's probably at an 800 or higher. We've got good light on there. We don't have a lot of motion, and because I think this is a long... f-stop. We don't have any foreground to background separation. We can clearly make that out. So f22, long exposure of some type because of those lines that we're seeing coming through the back. And then on top of that, our ISO is going to be a little bit higher, and that's where we're going to see the graininess in the black parts of the sky and on some of those skyscrapers too. I'm trying to look at the bike. I don't see a lot of graininess on the physical bike, maybe in the black tires on the front wheel a little bit. That's arching in the front. But that's what I would say for that one. And then again, learning your camera is only the start. Anyone can learn to use a camera. It's really important to put this into practice. I'm a stickler on this one because I'm the worst. I was trained how to use a camera technically because as an artist, as a painter and a drawer, I take pictures and I film my artwork. And so knowing how to use the camera technically versus practicing with it on a regular basis is better for me because I can set my camera up when I need to take my shots. I get my picture in 4 to 5 clicks is my expertise. But if I'm the person who's taking professional photography, infant photography, street photography, I'm doing newborns, I'm doing family photos, I'm doing homecoming prom, you gotta learn how to use, and you gotta actually not only learn, but put it all into practice, right? So best camera accessories is always practice, practice, practice. 10,000 hours of practice makes perfect. Never truly makes perfect, but if you practice for 10,000 hours, you're going to be a really good photographer, let me tell you. Keep taking classes. If you've got a rec center that offers classes, or the YMCA, or a community college. I mean, one of the places I learned was at the Chicago community colleges. They have a beautiful photo lab where they teach you both digital and non-digital. It's amazing. YouTube channels you love. Find a few people that talk specifically about the brand of cameras that you use, or who talk about all cameras. You're going to find people out there that absolutely adore and love camera specs. They love nerding out about it. They love the information that comes out of it. So my class is great if you're just trying to break into it and get an adjustment and learn. But if you're somebody out there who has more expertise and this isn't enough for you, you got to go on YouTube. They're free. They're great. All you got to do is like and subscribe, and if you really get into them, you can follow these people on different platforms and social medias and really learn what it means to become their level of photography, and they'll give you all the bits and pieces, so it's awesome. Workshops. I get a lot of people who are part of 2 different workshop clubs that I know of in the area. There's a botanical garden shooting club, which is wonderful. I've seen so many beautiful photos from those students and from those guys. Awesome photographers, but what's awesome about it is it's a community between a bunch of them where they're all taking photos together, showing them as a group, and then discussing. They're commenting on the photos, on the composition, on the lighting, on the whole thing. Like, what's the artistry of a photo? And I think that's where, art college was really fun, because you have what we call critiques, where you sit there and you critique somebody's work and you say, I like this part, but why did you do this? What does this stand for? Like, how does this affect how I'm looking at it? There's workshops that do the same thing, where once you get past the technical aspects of taking photos, now it's all about the conversation that a photo sparks for you, if that's what you're interested in. And then travel photography. Get on a plane, you should have a camera with you. If you're someone who buys this beautiful camera setup and you leave it home during vacation, I question whether or not you should have gotten that camera. And I don't mean that in a rude way. It's just the whole point of having this beautiful hunk of machinery is to take it out, expose yourself to new things, and take photos. Take photos of things that are uncomfortable to you, because at the very end of the day, it's going to lead to some really beautiful things. And exploration of the camera, traveling and exploring with the camera, can only lead to more success with it, as long as you're careful. I do understand the whole thing of losing or having it stolen, totally different ballpark. If you're walking around with a $9,000 setup, you might want to readjust and get a better camera. But if you're walking around with a $1,500 camera, keep that thing around your neck, but bring it with you. You will not regret the photos you take. You will not regret bringing that camera with you. Other recommended accessories. Now let me move my little webcam capture out of the way. There I go. Alright, so recommended accessories. As always, I cannot express enough. You don't need much to get started. Anybody who tells you you have to buy all these accessories right away is just trying to sell you some stuff. To start, you need a camera, you need a lens, you need an SD card, and you should get a strap. Most cameras that you buy nowadays will come with a strap inside the box. Some people have sensitive necks, or they're particular on what they get. I personally only use a leather strap. I just like the way that leather feels on my neck. It doesn't give me a rash like some of the nylon materials do. I have gotten there's a term for it. It's a strap rash. That's it. So, lens, camera body, the 2 most important things. One thing they will not give you inside your camera is storage. No camera company out there gives you any SD card of any kind. If they do, it's for a smaller point-and-shoot camera, or maybe an action camera like a DJI or GoPro. But you're going to need an SD card to get started. From there, once you get more into it, let's say you're traveling, get yourself a bag. It's useful. You'll use it. Extra battery and a memory card. If you're going into the field and you're shooting, have an extra memory card, or have an extra memory card and an extra battery with you. Something could malfunction on the card. You might get an error message on the camera that says cannot save. What do you do then? If you only have one SD card, you're SOL. But if you have an extra battery and an extra memory card, you can always swap things out and change. I usually carry one extra battery with me when I'm shooting, just in case. I charge all my gear up the day before, and I have it ready to go, packed away. But what if I didn't plug my charger in all the way? What if I thought it was charging, or I went to bed and somehow the battery exploded? Something happened crazy, and I have no control over it. If you only got one battery, it's not the easiest thing to do. Lens cleaning kit. If you're doing photography in the rain, snow, the sleet, mud, anything sports related too, where things can get kicked up at your face, events, shows, oh my God, people who bring cameras to concerts that don't have some form of rag that they can wipe it off, and your t-shirt does not count. You need to have some form of microfiber cloth. I don't care if you have a filter on your lens, have a microfiber. Number one, it protects your lenses, leads to less scratching. Number two, it's just better overall for cleaning off the camera. And your shirt, cotton, that material is just not good for the glass of the lens. You can lead to fine micro scratches. And then if, let's say, you try to resell your gear in the future because you want to upgrade, it's a lot harder to sell something like that. So carry a cloth with you of some kind, a nice microfiber handkerchief. Just keep it in your back pocket. That's one thing you should have. But a cleaning kit usually comes with a spray, a little bit of a brush, and then comes with the rag itself too. All three useful pieces. Strap, we already talked about that. You heard me using terms like monopod, tripod. Those are great things to have, not necessary. If you do want to do long exposure, you're doing more professional photography work, like portraits, like still lifes of animals, yes, get yourself a tripod. You will not regret it, and it will lead to a better photo final for you. External hard drives. I talk about this in the beginning intro class, but one of the things I always recommend to my students is get an external hard drive so that you can save your photos and you can save your information to two sources rather than one. You put everything on the computer, that's great, but now you spill coffee on the computer, or the computer crashes, or somebody snatches your computer and runs. Now you have none of your work. All these years of photos you've been taking, nothing. So cloud-based solution like Google Photos, Prime Photo, or hard drive. I use an external hard drive. I have two. One lives in a safe under my bed in case the house catches fire. One stays about 10 feet away from the computer in its own drawer, so that way I don't spill any coffee on it on accident. But I literally have work from when I was 10, 12 years old, artwork that I've been making ever since that. I don't own the pieces anymore, but I own a photo of the piece, which I really appreciate. Polarizer filter and ND filters. Any filters on there are great. You know, I mean, just having a regular standard ND filter is, or having a regular UV filter is great. Polarizing filter helps you cut through intense glares on water, ice, reflective or metallic surfaces, snow. Awesome. ND filters mix and match. So their neutral density switch between being all polarized and then also to that UV. Additional lenses, let's talk about those a little bit further. I think it's on the next slide here. Before I get into lenses, my age-old saying, date your body, marry your glass. I said it earlier. I totally recommend it. If you have $5,000 that you want to spend on a camera, your body should be about $1,500 and your lenses should be the rest. Or you got $3,000, you know, let's say you got $1,500. The camera body should be, if you got $1,500, you should be getting the kit. Absolutely buy the kit. If you're low on whatever the funds are, buy the kit. But remember that in the long run of things, you've got more money to spend later on. Don't keep upgrading your body and have the same kit glass. You're never going to really progress past a certain point, and you'll always be a little frustrated with your photos at the end of the day. And I will promise you that. I have too many people who come into my class who have an ancient camera, 15, 20 years old, and they're buying gorgeous lenses, and they have a really old camera, and they're just trying to take better photos with it, and they don't understand why their body that they bought all these years ago and the glass that they have doesn't do the trick, or they bought this brand spanking new body and they're still using all their old lenses. They just don't understand why their pictures still don't look good. It's all about the glass as much as it is about the body. That glass has so much to do with the image quality that you're getting. So date the body. You can always get a new camera body, but the glass is the special part. Before I go more into lenses, let's talk about focal length and zoom. I know we're going a little over time here. I appreciate everybody who's been with me on this one. I will open the floor up to questions. Ask questions if you want now so I see them right away. Go ahead and type them in, but I'll keep talking. When we look at a 70 millimeter there, we can see that our whole image is encompassed, but we can see that the birds, which is the main thing, are very tight in the center of the image. We get more of a landscape shot than a portrait. Now we move to 105. We're getting more of the land that the birds are the kind of this, you know, turf area or dirt area, island maybe. But we see less of the birds still. Now we move in, we see more of the birds, less of this turf area, but still not quite enough at the 200 millimeter. 400 though, very clear, in detail, and now we see everything. So focal